Your heart can feel completely right and still lead you completely wrong. Not because you're dishonest, not because you're broken, but because your heart was never meant to lead you. There are some sentences you don't remember learning. No one sat you down and taught them to you. You just grew up hearing them, seeing them, absorbing them. And over time, they started to feel true. Follow your heart is one of those sentences. It shows up in movies, in songs, in the quiet moments when someone is standing at a crossroads, trying to decide what to do with their life. And when you hear it, it doesn't sound wrong. It sounds honest. Honest, it sounds freeing. It sounds like the kind of advice that leads you towards something real. Because who wants to live a life that isn't true? Who wants to ignore what they feel deep inside? So we listen. And we trust it. We trust it. Mine, sometimes without even realizing we've made that decision. But if you slow down for a moment and look back not at what you believed, but at where it actually led you, you may start to notice something. Some of the decisions that shaped your life the most were not made because you were confused. They were made because you felt sure. You felt peace about it, but you felt drawn to it. You said, maybe even out loud, I just know in my heart. And yet, not all of those roads led where you thought they would. Some of them took you further than you intended to go. Some of them left you carrying things you didn't expect to carry. And some of them, if you're honest, you wouldn't choose again. If something can feel this right and still lead you this far off, then was your heart ever meant to lead you at all? Part 1, it felt right until it wasn't. There are moments in life when you don't hesitate. You don't sit there weighing every possibility. Something inside you becomes quiet, settled, and you move, not because you've figured everything out, but because it feels right, and that feeling carries a kind of authority. It doesn't argue, it doesn't ask for proof. It simply says, this is it. For some, it begins with a relationship. Not something uncertain, but something that feels almost too natural to question. The conversations flow, the connection feels effortless, and you find yourself thinking, I don't have to force this. And over time, you stop examining it the way you would have at the beginning. Not because you're careless, but because you feel at peace with it. You tell yourself, if this feels this right, it can't be wrong. For others, it shows up in decisions about direction, a path you choose, a door you walk through, not because it makes perfect sense, but because something in you leans toward it. A job, a move, a risk that doesn't come with guarantees, but it feels aligned. Not loud, not emotional, just a quiet confidence that feels trustworthy enough to follow. And in those moments, you're not lying to yourself. You're not trying to ignore the truth. If anything, you're trying to live honestly. You don't want a life that only looks right on the outside. You want something real. So you listen to that inner sense that feels clear, grounded, even peaceful. That's why what comes next is so hard to name. Because nothing about the beginning felt like a mistake. It felt like clarity. But then slowly, things begin to shift. Not all at once. Just small things. A conversation that leaves you slightly unsettled. A moment that doesn't quite sit right. A thought you push away because you don't want to overthink it. At first you explain it. You give it the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes that's fair. Not everything difficult means something is wrong. But over time, those small things don't disappear. They stay. They build. And what once felt simple becomes complicated. What once felt light becomes heavy. What once felt certain starts to require effort to keep believing. And then, almost quietly, you realize you're somewhere you didn't expect to be. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in a subtle awareness. You look at where this has led, what it's asking you to carry, and something in you pauses. Because if you're honest, you didn't get here by being careless. You got here while feeling sure. You got here while trusting something that felt steady enough to follow. And that's what stays with you. Because the beginning didn't feel wrong. It felt right. Part 2, the real issue, when the heart becomes the guide. The hard part isn't admitting that something went wrong. The harder part is facing how you got there. Because most of the time, you didn't arrive through confusion. You arrived through confidence. You saw enough to move forward, you felt enough to commit, and somewhere along the way, that feeling became the thing you leaned on the most. Not as one voice among many, but as the final word. It's not that your heart is trying to mislead you. It's not that your emotions are fake or meaningless. In many ways, they are the most honest part of you. They respond quickly, they react deeply, and they often tell you what matters to you before anything else does. But that's exactly what makes them so persuasive. Because when something feels strong enough, it doesn't just inform your decision. It begins to drive it. You start to interpret everything through it. What feels right becomes what is right. What feels wrong becomes something to avoid. And without saying it out loud, your heart slowly moves from being something you listen to something you follow. And here's what most people never stop to notice. That same heart that once felt so certain doesn't always stay that way. There are days when it feels clear, steady, almost unshakable. And then there are moments, sometimes just hours later, when that clarity begins to blur. What once felt obvious now feels uncertain. What once felt peaceful now feels restless. The direction hasn't changed, but the feeling has, and suddenly the thing you trusted the most is no longer saying the same thing. Not because you're dishonest, not because you're unstable, but because your heart was never built to carry that kind of weight. It responds, it reflects, it reacts, but it doesn't always see far enough to lead, and yet we treat it as if it does. We expect it to be consistent when it was never designed to be constant. We expect it to be reliable when it is deeply influenced by everything around us. Our fears, our desires, our wounds, even our mood in a given moment. And so without realizing it, we place something shifting in the position of something stable. The scriptures say it in a way that's both honest and unsettling. Jeremiah 17:9. Not as a condemnation, but as a kind of clarity. A reminder that the very thing we trust the most can also be the hardest to fully understand. Because the issue isn't that you feel, the issue is what happens when feeling becomes direction, when desire becomes decision, when what moves you becomes what leads you. And at that point, you're no longer just listening to your heart, you're depending on it. And that changes everything. Part 3. Why this idea keeps pulling us back. The strange thing is, even after the heart has led us wrong before, we still want to trust it again. We may look back on an old decision and admit, I should have known better. We may remember the warning signs we ignored, the uneasiness we pushed aside, the pain that followed. And yet when something new appears, something that touches the same deep place inside us, we find ourselves listening again. Because follow your heart is not powerful simply because it sounds inspiring. It is powerful because it speaks to places in us that are often tired, lonely, and hungry. A lonely person does not only want advice, they want companionship. A wounded person does not only want wisdom, they want relief. A heart that has waited a long time to be loved can begin to mistake intensity for truth. And when something finally makes you feel wanted, noticed, or alive again, it becomes very hard to step back and ask hard questions. That is why the heart can be so persuasive. It does not always come to you sounding reckless. Sometimes it sounds tender. Sometimes it sounds hopeful. It says, maybe this time is different. Maybe this is the door I've been waiting for. Maybe if I walk away now, I'll miss the one thing I may never get again. And those thoughts do not feel foolish in the moment. They feel human. They feel understandable. They feel like the kind of hope you are afraid to lose. We see this in ordinary life all the time. Someone goes back to a relationship they already know is unhealthy, not because they forgot the pain, but because loneliness made the familiar feel safer than obedience. Someone keeps chasing a dream that is slowly consuming their soul, not because they cannot see the cost, but because the fear of missing out whispers, what if this is your only chance? Someone opens a door they know they should leave closed, because for one brief moment it makes them feel seen again. This is why the story of King David is so sobering. David was not a man without knowledge of God. He had sung of the Lord as his shepherd. He had trusted God in caves, on battlefields, in seasons of danger and waiting. And yet when he saw Bathsheba, something in him stayed where it should have turned away. His problem was not that he lacked truth. His desire carried him further than what he knew was right. One look became another moment. One moment became a decision. And desire, left unchecked, began to rewrite the boundaries. That is what the heart often does. It does not always erase truth at once. It simply makes something else feel more urgent. Loneliness becomes louder than wisdom. Desire becomes louder than warning. Fear of missing out becomes louder than peace. And before a person ever says, "I have chosen wrong," they have usually said many smaller yeses inside. So the reason this idea keeps pulling us back is not because we are stupid. It is because the heart knows how to speak in the language of our deepest needs. It promises relief. It promises love. It promises that this time will be different. And unless something deeper than desire is guiding us, we will keep mistaking the strength of a longing for the voice of truth. Part 4. The night Jesus didn't follow his heart. There is a moment, quiet and almost hidden, where even Jesus had to face what he felt, not in front of crowds, not while teaching, but alone in a garden, in the hours before everything would change. It is the night before the cross, and this is not the version of faith most people imagine. There is no calm confidence here, no sense that everything feels right. There is weight, there is sorrow, there is a pressure so deep that it cannot be ignored. And in that moment, Jesus does not hide what he feels. He does not pretend to be above it. He speaks it honestly. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. If it is possible, let this cup pass from me." That is not detachment. That is not distance. That is real emotion, clear, direct, and deeply human. And if follow your heart is the way we are meant to live, then this would have been the moment to turn away, to step back, to choose relief, to listen to what felt most real in that moment. But he doesn't, and this is the part most people miss. He doesn't deny what he feels, but he doesn't follow it either. He allows the feeling to be fully present, without letting it become the final decision. "Not my will, but yours be done." That is not the absence of emotion. It is a choice made in the presence of it. This is where the difference begins to show. Most of us do not struggle with whether we feel something deeply. We struggle with what we do once we feel it. When something feels strong, we move toward it. When something feels heavy, we move away from it. Over time, that becomes our pattern, and without realizing it, feeling becomes direction. But in that garden, Jesus reveals something different. Not a life without emotion, but a life where emotion is no longer in charge. He feels the full weight of what is ahead, and still he does not allow that feeling to decide the path. And suddenly the question shifts. It is no longer simply about whether your heart feels something strongly. It becomes about what happens when what you feel and what is right are not the same. Because in that moment, Jesus does not follow what he feels. He follows something deeper, something that does not change with the intensity of the moment. And that is what makes this so confronting. It means the answer is not to stop feeling, but it also means feeling is not enough to lead. It means there is a way to be honest about what is happening inside you without handing it the authority to decide your life. And maybe that is the question this moment leaves behind. Not whether your heart speaks, but whether you have ever learned how to listen without letting it lead. Part 5. What the Bible actually invites you into. By the time you reach this point, it would be easy to assume that the answer is to pull away from your own heart, to become guarded, detached, less responsive to what you feel. But that is not what the Bible invites you into. It never asks you to shut down your emotions or to live a life where nothing moves you. In fact, some of the most honest emotional words ever written come from within Scripture itself. The issue has never been that you feel too much. The issue is what happens when what you feel becomes the center of how you decide. There is a passage that speaks into this with a kind of clarity that is easy to quote but harder to live. Proverbs 3:5. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. This is not a call to ignore your heart. It is a call to trust God with it. It does not say, set your heart aside. It says, bring your whole heart, but do not lean on it as your foundation. That distinction changes everything. Because when something becomes your foundation, it becomes the thing that carries the weight of your decisions. It becomes the reference point you return to, the place you look when you are unsure. And for many people, without ever saying it out loud, that place has become their own feelings. Not completely, not consciously, but enough that when something feels right, it moves them, and when something feels wrong, it stops them. But feelings were never meant to carry that kind of responsibility. They were meant to move, not to lead. They were meant to respond, not to decide. They were meant to reveal something within you, not to define what is ultimately true. And this is where a different picture begins to emerge. Your heart is not something to be silenced, it is something to be placed. It is like a powerful engine. It generates movement, energy, direction. It can take you far. It can make life feel alive. It can respond to what is beautiful, what is meaningful, what matters. But an engine, no matter how strong, was never meant to decide the destination. If it does, it will simply follow its own impulses, accelerating toward whatever draws it in the moment. An engine needs direction. It needs something outside of itself that can see further than it can. And this is what the Bible is inviting you into, not a life without feeling, but a life where feeling is no longer the center. A life where your heart is still fully alive, still fully engaged, but no longer carrying the weight it was never designed to bear. A life where something deeper, something steadier, something unchanging becomes the one that leads. To trust in the Lord with all your heart is not to abandon it. It is to stop placing it at the center. It is to let it be what it was always meant to be, alive, responsive, deeply human, but no longer the thing that determines your path. Because when the heart is no longer trying to lead, it is finally free to be what it was created to be. And for the first time, you begin to see what it looks like to live not without emotion, but with a kind of direction that emotion alone could never provide. Part 6. When you stop letting feelings lead, at first it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like restraint. There are moments when everything in you wants to move in one direction, and you don't. You pause. You hold back. You choose something that doesn't match what you feel in that moment, and no one sees it. There is no applause, no visible reward, just a quiet decision that feels almost invisible, but it isn't. Because something begins to change there. Not all at once, not in a way you can immediately point to, but over time, you start to notice that you are no longer being pulled in every direction. Your feelings shift. The urgency fades. That sense of "I have to act on this right now" begins to lose its grip. You still feel things deeply, honestly, but they no longer carry the same authority they once did. And that changes how you move through life. You begin to realize that not every feeling needs a response. Not every desire needs to be followed. Not every moment of clarity is actually direction. There is a space that starts to open between what you feel and what you choose. And in that space, something steadier begins to form. A kind of stability that isn't tied to whether things are going well or not. A kind of peace that doesn't rise and fall with every shift in your circumstances. You still have good days and difficult ones. You still feel joy, frustration, longing, even uncertainty. But you are no longer defined by those moments. You are no longer reacting, you are choosing. And that is a very different way to live. Because when feelings are leading, life tends to move in waves. What feels right today may not feel right tomorrow. What feels certain in one moment can disappear in the next. And without realizing it, you are constantly adjusting, constantly responding, constantly trying to stay aligned with something that keeps moving. But when feelings are no longer in charge, something deeper begins to hold you in place. You don't need everything to feel right in order to move forward. You don't need perfect clarity to take the next step. You don't need your emotions to confirm every decision before you make it. There is a quiet confidence that begins to take shape, not because everything makes sense, but because you are no longer depending on what changes. And over time you start to experience something many people are searching for but rarely find. Not excitement, and not constant reassurance, but peace. A peace that isn't fragile. A peace that doesn't disappear the moment things become uncertain. A peace that remains even when what you feel is unsettled. Because it was never built on what you feel in the first place. And once you begin to live that way, you start to understand something that is hard to explain but easy to recognize when it's there. You are no longer being led by whatever rises within you. You are being held by something that doesn't move. Conclusion: by now it should be clear this was never about silencing your heart. It was never about becoming distant from what you feel or learning how to ignore the very things that make you human. The Bible does not ask you to become less alive. It does not call you into a life where nothing moves you, where nothing touches you, where nothing matters deeply. Your heart is not the problem, but it was never meant to carry what we've been asking it to carry. It was never meant to hold the weight of your direction, your identity, your decisions, your future. And when it does, it begins to strain under something it cannot sustain. It shifts, it reacts, it pulls, it leans, because that is what it was designed to do. But somewhere along the way, we took something that was meant to respond and asked it to lead. And that is where everything begins to drift. Because when what leads you is always changing, your life will feel like it is always adjusting, always trying to keep up with something that never quite stays the same. And even when it feels right for a moment, there is always that quiet uncertainty underneath it, because deep down you know how quickly that feeling can change. But there is something else, something that does not shift with your emotions, something that does not rise and fall with your circumstances, something that does not speak one way today and another way tomorrow. Not distant, not cold, but steady, present, faithful. And maybe that is what your heart has been reaching for all along. Not something that simply agrees with it, but something strong enough to guide it. Because when your heart is no longer trying to lead, it finally becomes free to do what it was created to do, to feel deeply, to respond honestly, to come alive in the right places without having to decide everything on its own. And that changes the way you live. You no longer need every step to feel certain. You no longer need every moment to feel clear. You can move forward even when your emotions are unsettled, because you are no longer depending on them to tell you where to go. You are trusting something deeper, someone deeper. So maybe the invitation was never to follow your heart. Maybe it was to bring your heart somewhere, to place it in the hands of the one who does not change. And in doing so, to finally discover what it means to live, not without feeling, but without being led by what was never meant to lead you.